morning and or evening. Today is the 8th of July, 2020. It is a Wednesday. I'm Brach Jennings.
And I'm Peter Clark.
And this is your friendly neighborhood Lutheran theology podcast, Stumbling Block.
And I am recording outside today with a different headset and microphone setup than normal, so apologies if the sound quality is different.
Well, you also have something different going on with your recording today. You have a pipe.
I do. I decided I needed a pipe this morning.
And what on earth convinced you that you would need a pipe?
Just felt like it. Had a bit of a stressful morning. Wanted to... Pipes make me feel better.
And is it working?
Mm-hmm. It definitely is.
Well, Peter, I guess we've got some news to share with our listeners now that you have a pipe and are settled. We did not air the episode that we recorded last week.
We did not. That is correct.
And maybe you can tell our listeners the reason behind it. This was Peter's decision. There have been some episodes in the past where we have recorded and either something has gone wrong or we didn't like how it turned out, or there have been a few that didn't make the cut, which I don't know. For us, that might be saying something,
right? I just think there was some. At least on my part, for sure. Some white defensiveness going on. Some things that I think I didn't necessarily want 100% out in public.
Uh-huh.
There's a lot of things that I'm really struggling with in terms of what's going on right now. And I didn't feel comfortable airing it.
Well, I think that's remarkable to say. Admitting a struggle, admitting... that maybe one wants to try again and see how one learns.
Mm-hmm.
I have to say, I didn't even get to hear the rough cut. Peter just made the decision. We're not hearing this.
Nope, not happening.
No, this is probably payback, because there was one time where I did that to you. Matter of fact, I called you at like 9 o'clock at night, tubing in time.
There's been at least one time where you made me take down one I'd already posted.
Yeah. So, it's all in the editing process, and as we get better at this, and as we do it for longer, it'll be good and crisp and clear.
Yep.
The birds sound lovely. Are those your birds or my birds?
They might be my birds.
I think they're your birds, because I've got headphones on. So, anyway, I wanted to talk today about something that we have addressed before, we have gone back and forth about, we have even, I dare say, talked past one another on this in our early days of this show. Resulting in you throwing a pen at me.
Uh-huh.
But I don't think there will be any pen throwing today, because I want to ask a larger question. And that is the question of methodology. And what I mean by that is, when you were at Luther Seminary and you were studying, were you ever, or your class, were you ever asked to frame the question, how do we justify Christian theological biblical study in a secular world?
No.
Never, not once.
No.
Was the existence of God presupposed?
Yes.
And so then my next question, if you had to speak about the existence of God in a secularized world, how would you do it?
That's a good question.
I'm glad you got your pipe, because you can ponder it.
Ponder. That wasn't part of our training. That wasn't what we were trained to do. We were trained to talk to congregants about God.
But the church is dying drastically.
Yeah.
And by the way, I'm not picking on the American Lutherans right now. I can't remember the exact number of how many hundreds of thousands of members from the Protestant Church of Germany left in the last year.
Right.
Theology schools are in crisis and crumbling. Theology as an intellectual discipline is in recent years yet again on the table in Germany of, are they really doing anything that could be called valid science over there with their weird claims and dogmatics? Divinity schools in places like Yale, even though Yale was founded as a center for training ministers, have the fewest number of students of the professional schools.
Mm-hmm.
The University of Chicago, which also had a divinity school from its inception, I know this from a graduate of there. The students who are not divinity students sort of look down on the divinity school as, well, are you guys really doing academics? So in settings like this, both the church losing numbers, theological seminaries drastically declining, theological faculties in universities, both in Europe and in America, I dare say, having to justify their existence of doing valid science. Mm-hmm. How might we respond to why it is valid to speak of God today? He's smoking his pipe. He's thinking about it. If you want to go all C.S. Lewis on me, go all C.S. Lewis on me. Just some kind of whatever you got for me, I'm interested in.
I think in a lot of ways, I think Christianity has something to say as to why human life is valuable.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because we're made in the image of God. I think there's a value to that. I think that's worth speaking of.
But that's presupposing God exists again, doesn't it?
I suppose.
Okay, sorry, keep going.
No, it's fine. I have difficulty not presupposing that God exists.
Okay.
Part of that's my upbringing. Part of that's my life experience.
Mm-hmm.
I've radically experienced the presence of God and the presence of evil.
Mm-hmm.
And in some ways, again, right, like Christianity is a mystery religion.
I'm not saying that one would rationally solve all this, by the way.
Okay, that's kind of where I thought you were going, but all right, I guess not.
No, I'm not. I'm not saying that reason can solve everything. But I am asking, how might we say Christianity is reasonable as a worldview and as an object of confessional inquiry?
Huh. Those are good questions.
These are questions that have been put to me for the last year by our former guest, Volker Lupin.
Yes. I think, I don't have a good answer.
Okay.
To be entirely honest. It's not a question that I've considered to any great extent.
What's interesting to me, and I'm not saying that I have a great answer either, but I've started to think about it probably since I met Professor Lupin. Mm-hmm. Whether I wanted to or not, I had to, particularly when I asked him to be on my committee. I mean, that was just the end of it. It would be like if I tried not to have any history in my dissertation. Yet right. You ask a Reformation historian to be your secondary supervisor. What are you thinking?
No idea.
Although I did spend about 4 months trying to dehistoricize everything, and well, let me tell you how well that worked. Mm-hmm. It didn't. Mm-hmm. Every time I try to slither away, he traps me again with history. I have found an interesting ally in this question, though, at his leading, and that is in Wolfhart Pannenberg.
You were writing about him on Facebook the other day.
I was writing about him on Facebook. I'm developing a surprising intellectual crush on a rampant homophobe. Now, in Pannenberg's defense, he wasn't a homophobe until late in life, at least as far as I know. Or at least he wasn't publicly. And, before anybody says, how contradictory I'm being. I would consider myself, whether I want to be or not, somewhat influenced by Gerhard Forde. And Gerhard Forde was viciously anti-gay. Mm-hmm. Viciously. Later in his life as he was dying of Parkinson's. So, I mean, nobody's perfect. But what I appreciate about Pannenberg is all about methodology. And so I'm currently reading a text when I'm not studying Hebrew, when I'm not working on Luther's Romans lectures, called Theology and the Philosophy of Science. And Pannenberg basically argues, and this is just in the first 50-some pages of the book, theology is every bit as rigorous as physics. And theologians have the right to be considered as much of scholars as physicists do. Well, for me, at the risk of sounding like a Reaganite, that trickles down. Because if the theologians train future ministers as scientists, you have at least a basis for a reasonable encounter with Christian theology and Christian faith.
Okay.
You don't have reason ruling everything. That's not what I'm saying. That I wouldn't. Right. That's ultimately there is an element of faith, but you have a coherent, logical structure to an argument that may help convince why Christianity is still valid today. Mm-hmm. And I think also an argument is in Paul Tillich. I've always thought that. I think he is one of the best from the Germans who immigrated. Well, I don't know how many German theologians actually did this, but as a German theologian who immigrated to America, what he brought to the American audience, dare I say, well, maybe not even just introducing the tradition of German idealism, of Schelling and Hegel, and really forcing an American audience. By the way, Americans tend not, and I know this from my own experience, to use an American argument of experience, I know this from my own experience, but also just how seminaries are shaped. Americans who are doing theology tend not so much to like philosophy.
Right.
Of the Protestants. And it's really ironic because the Protestant philosophers, at least who come out of the German Enlightenment tradition, there's a line from Luther to Hegel. Mm-hmm. Now, it may not be a line that every Lutheran theologian likes, but there is a line. Mm-hmm. From Luther's Good Friday Passion mysticism to Hegel's statement that on Good Friday God dies on the cross. Mm-hmm. Which I love because Zizek picks that up. And Zizek says the only way to be an atheist is to go through Christianity. And I love that. Right. I love that. I absolutely love that. But, it's my dream to study with Zizek one day.
Well, there it is.
It's a totally unrealistic dream, but in my wildest fantasies, I do postdoctoral research with Zizek. Just because I want to hear how many times he'd look at me and say "F you" to me. I'm very curious about this. But anyway, what I'm surprised, though, is as our seminary enrollments decrease, mm-hmm. as our congregations, and obviously this is not just for Lutherans, it's across the mainline church in America. I'm going to speak only in that context right now, so if any of my friends from Germany are listening, I'm not going to talk about this context because I don't quite know it as well yet.
Right.
But across the mainline in America, the church is declining. Why aren't we, as thinkers, as future ministers, as teachers, why aren't we doing some of the rigor of a Pannenberg?
I don't know. I think in some, or when in the United States in particular, we're struggling with this cultural Christianity issue.
Hmm.
Right? And so, for some people, there's an attempt to return to that, which doesn't require the rigor of a Pannenberg.
Or a Tillich, or a Vitor Vestella, for that matter. I mean, Vitor was a Hegelian. He was trained in. I mean, I picked up Hegel through Guillermo Hansen and Vitor Vestella. By the way,
Right.
I didn't just pick up Hegel because I thought it was fun. I got it from them, and then I began to think about the and also from Maltman. Maltman would consider himself a left Hegelian.
Mm-hmm.
But I started with Guillermo and Vitor. Yeah, if it's cultural Christianity, it doesn't require that kind of rigor. But then why aren't we just fools? And I'm not talking about fools in the sense of fools for Christ, right? that before you learn Aristotle, first you ought to become foolish in Christ, is one of Luther's philosophical theses in the Heidelberg Disputation points out, right? That makes sense to me. You can do a cruciform look at Aristotle. I don't know how you do it because I don't know Aristotle well enough, but, you know.
Yeah.
Why are we shirking intellectual rigor and depth and even intellectual justification for why we think that seminaries should be entitled to government student loans? Side note, for any of our listeners who may not have been to seminary, a majority of seminary graduates, at least when Peter and I went through, were paying for their education in a substantial way by federally funded student loans.
Woo-woo.
So my question is, the federal government's going to keep funding this, although, you know, it would sort of be nice if the whole thing blew up. But if they were going to keep funding it, how is what a seminary does? How can that be considered academic?
Well, student loans aren't about academics. You can get a student loan to go to a trade school.
Now see, I didn't know that. Okay. So one of my arguments then lessens, because one could say that a seminary was a vocational school.
Right.
But it would still be a vocational school that requires a heck of a lot of an academic foundation.
Mm-hmm.
So that brings back my question of how do both seminaries and the church safeguard that scientific academic foundation?
I'm not sure the church is particularly... The church is primarily more concerned with the seminary as a trade school, I think.
And therein lies the problem.
I mean, I'm just honesty there, you know?
The Reformation, at the risk of perpetuating a bit of a myth, the Reformation is based on rigorously and deeply university-educated clergy.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm not saying that the seminaries aren't as good as a place like Tübingen. I believe that, actually. I think I'm very grateful for my time at all the seminaries I was at. But I do think when the larger denomination starts viewing seminaries as trade schools, we lose the theological depth and rigor that not only the Reformation tradition, but also just the great Catholic tradition in general is based on.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the fathers knew the philosophers of their day.
Yep, absolutely.
And they were in dialogue with them.
Mm-hmm.
How many of our MDiv students are required to read a book by people like Zizek?
Almost none.
Precisely. Unless you had somebody like Vitor or Guillermo or Lois Malcolm who integrates that work.
Right.
How many people know about the postmodern turn in philosophy, which also influenced theology? There's no queer theory without Derrida.
Mm-hmm.
There's no queer theology without queer theory. There's a whole lineage here, and I hadn't really even started discovering this until I came to Germany.
Right.
Where the philosophy faculty, by the way, is 20 seconds away from where I live.
Right.
And all of a sudden, I had people putting the question to me, what you do as a theologian is ridiculous. Tübingen! People in Tübingen said that to me. Students.
Right.
Oh, we had a great debate. And then, I don't know if I convinced him. I was debating with a Hegelian doctoral student. Oh, it was fun. Maybe she didn't say ridiculous, but perhaps it wasn't quite that strong. But it was just a little bit of, what exactly do you do as a theologian? And I think that's something that ought to be happening at our seminaries too.
Mm-hmm.
Luther Seminary is situated right by the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities.
Mm-hmm.
Why aren't students there required to go down and take a philosophy course? Take a history course? Did you learn Reformation history, by the way, as a secular discipline at Luther, or was it a confessional discipline?
I'm not sure what you mean.
Was it taught as if in some way Luther was right?
Well, yeah.
Yeah. It was for me too. And my favorite courses at PLTS were my Luther courses.
I mean,
but then
it was taught like that to me in my undergrad as well. I went to a Christian private school for undergrad, so.
Right. And then I got to Germany, where Lepine was lecturing to 100 students in a lecture hall in the law building. And all of a sudden, it was no longer assumed that Luther was right. But there were all these other voices to consider as well. And to be a good scientist, you had to look at all of them.
Mm-hmm.
I want to know why it's not taught like that in our seminaries.
It's not taught like that at any seminary.
Even at a place like Union?
Well, I don't know about Union, but at any denominational seminary, they start from the assumption that the denomination polity and confession is correct.
So
because they're designed to train pastors.
But then my question, somebody who also has that same training and, again, is very grateful for it, and considers myself writing within that confession.
Yes.
But I want to make that known. But my larger question is, now, how do we take that out into the wider world? To that coffee shop you've talked about in Madison before that you like.
Right. Well, trying to think how to put this. In my experience, people are more concerned with the practicalities than the theory. And so people want to know. People aren't, in my experience, people I've talked to aren't as concerned with whether or not God exists, but how believing God exists affects my life.
Mm-hmm.
How do I live my life based on that? How does it affect who I am, how I interact with the world? Things like that.
Even the people who aren't connected to the church are interested in that question?
Mm-hmm.
Because the people I met in Berkeley, by the way, would have said similar things. Why do you believe in God now? We have science.
But that gets to that same question, right? Of what? But they to me, a lot of it gets down to the experiential nature.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Subjectivity still exists, even in a world of science.
Yes, I certainly agree. And I think I think even it would be hard to do dogmatics without that notion of subjectivity.
Yeah. At the end of the day, I find my life greatly improved by my belief in God.
That's interesting. I don't find mine, but okay.
And so that's my first answer to that question.
Okay. But how do you find your life greatly improved?
I find it gives me a grounding in my ethics and morality.
I can hear Steve Paulson cringing at the moment.
Well, whatever.
Okay, it gives you a grounding in your ethics and your morality.
It gives me hope.
Mm-hmm.
It gives me a reason to believe that there's possibility for things to get better, that we're all in some... It gives me a grounding for my belief in a common struggle.
Mm-hmm.
My politics and my sense of justice, my sense of social justice, all of that is grounded in my faith in God.
Mm-hmm.
And all of that, I believe, makes my life better. So
that's what you would say if somebody asks you, why do you believe in God?
Yeah. I mean, there's more to it than that, but that's the elevator answer.
Okay. At one time, I would have said, I believe in God because it's just crazy enough to be true.
That's a good answer.
No, it isn't. If I said that in front of the Tübingen faculty, I would not pass my final doctoral exams.
I know, but most people aren't interested in passing their doctoral exams. They're interested in getting through life.
Oh. Yes. So I'm not trying to set up a binary between a rational, not total explanation, but a rational basis for why a coherent argument could be made. That's all.
I'm not sure there is one.
Well, I wasn't sure either until about 2 months ago I started to ask that question.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you could say, I'm going to speak from the university context now because it is, whether I like it or not, it is where I live now.
Mm-hmm.
Which is really weird to say because it never was that way. So anyway, universities exist for the quest for truth.
Mm-hmm.
Systematic theology, I'll speak for my own discipline, is a truth-seeking enterprise, just as those who study history, linguistics, philosophy, in other words, Geisteswissenschaften, the mind sciences, or the humanities.
Mm-hmm.
There are methods that we use, and it doesn't have to be the same method for every person, right? I really am getting attracted to some kind of deconstructionism because that goes along quite nicely with the theology of the cross.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sort of embracing being a postmodern. You know, why not just go off the deep end and see if I can make something interesting. So not everybody has to have the same method, but as a serious endeavor for the mystery of God, right? You want to witness? Well, no, pause. See, that's how you know I'm trained at a seminary originally, because I just began with witness. Right? So I'm going to hold that back for a second, and I'm going to say, before doing that, you want to... It seems to me, if a university exists for the quest of truth, it seems to me perfectly reasonable to ask the question about transcendence.
Okay.
Is there something more than what empiricism claims rules the day? A university committed to the question of truth ought to be able to ask that question.
Right.
Then, when one speaks, and I don't have this all cleared out, so ask me in a year. And in a year, I hope to be better methodologically than what I am now, because now I'm still trying to find a method. But my preliminary findings here. With theology, it seems to me this is the oldest university discipline. So I'm not going to speak of it in the sense of when European medieval universities are founded around 1200.
Right.
Theology is, along with medicine and law, that is the three higher faculties.
Yes.
Note, you can still get a doctor of theology, a doctor of law, and a doctor of medicine and Tübingen. Just pointing that out. Not saying it's the same. It all got shifted around many times since then. But so theology was always, according to Pannenberg, I've just learned, justifying itself as a science from 1200 on. Now, they did it differently in 1200, and they did it in Luther's day, and than we might today.
Yes.
But it seems to me that if theology is a rational, coherent, scholarly explanation for God, that it fully deserves to be front and, well, maybe not front and center, because it's not the queen of the sciences. That's too much. But it deserves to be part of the truth-seeking community of a university. Now, that presupposes, by the way, that universities are not just job training centers.
Right, which is how they've come to be.
Which is how they come to be. So maybe this whole model doesn't even work. But if I was going to start there to say theology is a truth-seeking discipline, that involves, by the way, a rational look at the Bible. Can we historically say anything about Jesus of Nazareth related to his resurrection? This is how you know I'm reading Pannenberg. Because now I'm starting to say, oh, yes, maybe. Maybe I was going too far with Rudolf Bultmann. Bultmann is right in the sense of you can't justify your faith on it. But you can give some rational, coherent, historical argument. Otherwise, I don't think this was Bultmann, by the way. I still will defend Bultmann. But otherwise, you run the risk of docetism. And Jesus had a body.
Yes, he did.
That body existed in human history. So,
yes.
Is there something we can say historically about this Jesus of Nazareth? That to me is becoming a very an increasingly interesting question. And I'm not just going to say, well, the Gospels say it, so that's what it is. No, that's irrationalism again. Is there something reasonable we can say about Jesus of Nazareth? The Germans have been working on me, Peter. Can you tell?
Oh my gosh. I mean, I think there are reasonable things we can say about Jesus of Nazareth, but I also wonder if it matters whether or not we can.
Yes, if we're going, I'm thinking now, and I wouldn't buy this, I wouldn't swallow this whole, right? But I think elements of this are quite helpful if we're going to talk to people outside of the church. I mean, I'm just floored when I think about the fact that even though I went to Berkeley, I went to the most secular part of the country, arguably, to do my MDiv, and I never effectively learned how to ask this question.
Yeah.
And so for the first time, I'm trying to ask the question. This isn't even necessarily so much related to my dissertation, but it will shape sort of how I come about theology in general. In other words, is theology for preaching? Or is it primarily a scholarly inquiry for the sake of questing for truth that then the charisma can be affected by?
That gets at the crux of the question, doesn't it?
What would you say?
I think that theology is primarily a question of praxis, of how we live our lives.
Okay. As an academic science, theology exists for practice.
See, I'm not sure. I go back and forth on theology as an academic science.
Okay.
Right. I also do the same for philosophy.
Okay.
I think to my mind,
yeah,
the primary ends of both theology and philosophy have to do with how we live our lives.
Yeah.
Right.
But sorry, go ahead.
Trying to find truth for truth's sake is a little masturbatory.
Yes, if it were to be taken to an absurd level. I'm not trying to go too far the other way.
Right.
I'm just saying, if we want to speak to people outside of the Sunday sermon, right? How might we do that in a rational and critical way?
I think we primarily do it by praxis.
But that's not.
I think the way we encounter the world is through our actions, primarily.
Okay, but then why can't a Buddhist do that? What's the point of being a Christian doing that? Buddhists do it better than we do, I think, sometimes.
No, they don't. If
All
they
right.
do, they're not good Buddhists. To be entirely honest.
Okay.
Buddhism is about the acceptance of pain and suffering in the world, not about the relieving of it.
Okay, so you don't agree with the radical Buddhism of the 60s and such.
I think it's an Americanized Buddhism, not true Buddhism.
Okay. Well, and there are as many different forms of Buddhism as there are Christianity. Well, okay, maybe not as many, but there are many, many forms.
Right.
From what I remember on the one class I had on Buddhism, I'm so mad at myself that I didn't do more with that. But anyway.
But my understanding of Buddhism is about the self, not about the community.
Okay. My understanding would be Buddhism is about your actions, not about what you believe. Not about what you believe. The poisoned arrow sutra of the Buddha. You know, if a man shows up with a poisoned arrow and you don't ask where did it come from or how did he get this way, you take the arrow out.
Yeah.
That to me is a question of praxis.
There is that.
So,
but it's not, to me, it's not the primary. That's an individual action. That's individual action, not about community.
Mm-hmm.
And Christianity is a much more community-centric religion.
If only it was practiced that way.
Well, right. I think there's a lot wrong with praxis in Christianity today.
Let me see if I can find another. All right, instead of using a Buddhist example, because that one isn't working as well as I thought it might. Why can't an atheist do the same kind of praxis that a Christian does and do it better?
Well, why does an atheist do it?
Humans want to care for your fellow humans.
Right, but at the end of the day, what keeps you from tending towards tribalism? For what reason does an atheist say, I go out of my way, even to the point of doing damage to myself to help my fellow person?
I don't know. You have to ask them. But I know there is an argument among the new atheists, whom Zizek calls idiots, by the way, but among the new atheists that you don't need God to be moral.
No, but they're still operating off of a Christian sense of morality.
Well, I think that's why one of the reasons why Zizek calls the new atheists idiots, because they don't really have an understanding of history.
Right.
In essence, they're evangelicals who are secularists.
Right. No, exactly. But they're still operating off of a Judeo-Christian foundation of morality.
Uh-huh. So you think then that by the demonstration of your actions, you could convince somebody of the reasonableness of the Christian faith?
I don't know, but I think it's a good starting point. It certainly wouldn't hurt.
Sure. Sure. I mean, I hadn't so much thought of it like that because I had always thought I had thought of the public discourse
Hmm.
aspect. You know,
Hmm.
something we Americans really suck at in the last 40 years or so. You know, that old thing about civic discourse. The point of having an education is to be good citizens. That old 19th century ideal that
Hmm.
actually might be worth preserving.
Right.
You know, there are a few things that I want to preserve, but that might be one of them. An intelligent conversation with people would be nice.
Right.
I'm thinking of certain Trump supporters at the moment. By the way, I've been listening to a lot of Ann Coulter last week.
Why? Why do you do
No,
that to yourself?
because people like her exemplify why reason matters.
No, they exemplify exactly why reason doesn't matter, because people believe them anyway.
So you don't think then that people would be persuaded by a logical argument contra her?
No, I don't.
So do we
I
just
don't think
believe what?
people are at their core reasonable.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I don't know what I think about that actually. I was asked that question by my mentor in college. It wasn't just me, by the way, it was in class. And he said, do you, meaning the class,
Yeah.
we really need, okay, English really needs a plural you, like German,
It is.
or
It's called.
Spanish, or French.
It's y'all.
Ew. Ew.
Oh,
A
oh, get
nicer
over.
form.
Oh, get over your northern self. Get over your northern self.
I
It's
say
y'all.
I say y'all all the time.
It's
But
y'all.
yeah, but here's the question: is there's y'all and then there's all y'all, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, uh, uh, do you? Because I'm just quoting the person who said it. Do you
Yeah.
think people are basically rational or irrational?
I think history proves that people are basically irrational. Persons can be reasonable.
Mm.
People are
As a group.
irrational.
Mm. But if persons can be rational, mightn't we use reason to prove people like Ann Coulter wrong?
And we can with some individual persons, but not all persons are rational.
Yeah. And what do we do about the irrationality of people?
We live with it. I mean, it's just part of the human condition. I mean, if I were rational, I would probably own entirely Linux machines because it's free, basically unhackable. I could probably figure out how to do most of what I want to do on it, or if I were a truly rational person, I could figure out how to program it. But I'm not. I'm irrational and I'm lazy, so I buy a Mac because it's easier for me to do things on a Mac.
As long as faith is not irrational and lazy.
I don't think faith is lazy. I'm not sure faith is rational. I go back and forth on that one.
I go back and forth on it too, to be honest. And I agree with you, by the way, contra people like Steve Paulson. I'm thinking of his books on Luther's Outlaw God. Well, it's not really Luther, it's his playing with Luther, but anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Luther's Outlaw God, where, you know, he just really harps on ethics and morality and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
I do think there is something to say about a Christian notion of praxis
Mm-hmm.
may in fact be God's call to our newly freed and justified selves.
Mm-hmm.
Which I still don't think is the third use of the law, by the way, just to be clear.
We'll get you there yet. We'll get you there yet.
You will not, and I have Oswald Bayer on my side. By the way, he would be helpful. His book, Theology the Lutheran Way,
Mm-hmm.
about theology both as a university discipline and as worship in the church.
Mm-hmm.
That more Lutheran students and Lutheran pastors need to read him. because he's 50-50. He is 50% church and 50% the rigor of the scholarship.
Right.
And he's one of the greatest Luther scholars of these last decades.
Mm-hmm.
But my concern from a seminary setting and from an ELCA setting, since that's the denomination you and I both know the best, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is we are losing the notion that Lutheranism was born unintentionally. It shouldn't have had to have been, but it was, in a university.
Mm-hmm. It's true.
And I think if we automatically presuppose the existence of God without even entertaining the question of why and how we might make that statement in today's world, mm-hmm. I think we do both the seminaries and the church a disservice. Mm-hmm. It's not to say that I don't think the experience and the gathering around word and sacrament and the way seminaries are set up where the truth of Jesus is primary. Yes, I agree with all of that. I want to uphold that. But I also want to ask, and how might we speak? I think you're asking the question of how might we live.
Yes.
I'm asking the question of how might we speak so that we may live, as you're saying. I want one more step, I think, now, than we presuppose the existence of God and we do the kerygma. Mm-hmm. I want just one more piece, and I wouldn't go as far as Pannenberg, by the way. So this is where I say I don't swallow Pannenberg whole. Mm-hmm. I'm not that much of an apologetic theologian. I'm much more sympathetic to the kerygmatic model. Mm. But how might we give a basis for that kerygma? Mm-hmm. Because otherwise, are we not just as ridiculous as Ann Coulter or as Donald Trump, mm-hmm. but with better politics?
It's good questions, man. It's good questions.
Now, at the risk of bragging, have I blown your brain as much as my own brain has been blown for the last 2 months?
Not quite. I mean, none of this is particularly new questions to me.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it blows my brain because I just had never really thought about it this way before.
Right, and again, like I grew up in a theologically academic family. Mm. Mm. Right, both of my parents have advanced seminary degrees. Mm. So,
and did they ask these kinds of questions?
I don't know that they asked them to me outright, but they gave me room to ask them.
Oh, that's nice of them. You know what I think it might be, at least for me, Peter? Last month, it was 10 years ago that I started going to a Lutheran church. Mm.
Yeah.
And I think now I'm ready as a theologian, becoming ready, mm-hmm. to just step back a bit, not a ton, but just a bit, and really ask, what right do I have as a theologian to say that I'm a scholar?
Right. Right.
Which is a question you don't have to ask in seminaries.
No.
It's assumed you're a scholar if you're studying for a doctorate.
Yeah. Yeah. I was just thinking, it's almost 10 years since a little over 10 years since I started going to a Lutheran church.
And how did you celebrate?
No, I mean, I don't know the exact date. It hadn't even occurred to me until you just brought it up.
And how would you say, if you just had to think off the top of your head, what would be one way that you might change? Might have changed.
Okay, yeah, that's easier.
Sorry, might have changed. I can do English grammar, I swear.
I have become a lot more open and accepting.
Okay.
since then. I will say that. My views on things like uh, giving the giving the Lord's Supper to people of all ages.
Mm-hmm.
My views on LGBTQIAA plus people in the church
Mm-hmm.
has advanced a lot since then.
Mm-hmm.
So, I will say one of the interesting things I've found about myself, and this is probably a personal thing. It's very interesting, and I've had a lot of people try and get me to like. I guess not a lot of people, but I've had a few people try and get me to like sign on to things and publicly identify myself as an ally
Mm-hmm.
of various movements, which I'm hesitant to do for various reasons, but not the least of which is that I don't think I'm educated enough in the issues. I don't think that I am as innately fully accepting as I need to be yet.
Mm-hmm.
To come like I'm still doing the work. To me, calling yourself an ally implies that you have already done the vast majority of the work on yourself that you need to do.
How is that not just legalism thinking that way?
Well, that's I don't know. I don't know, and maybe it is, but that's one of the reasons I've always been hesitant to identify. I'm certainly a comrade in arms.
Pecca fortiter, Peter. Sin boldly! Do not allow me to get better in Latin than you were.
I never had to learn theological Latin.
Okay, fine. And yeah, my theological Latin, I'm focusing on Hebrew right now, so,
Yeah.
But still, do not allow me to. Wait a minute, pause. I will not allow you to, in any shape or form.
Oh, you will, though, because you're going to use it more than me. That's okay.
I mean, I try to convince Professor Lepine that the language of systematicians in Europe, at least, is in European Protestantism, in European Lutheran Protestantism, is German. But he doesn't seem to buy that and keeps pushing me on Latin. It's such an interesting experience, though. I have people sending me texts in Latin, and it's just a very odd setting.
Well, I guess getting back to the sin boldly thing, I think that's one of the other reasons I have difficulty identifying myself as an ally sometimes, is I think that maybe I don't sin boldly enough in some of that stuff.
Oh, wow. Wow. I think if people are inviting you to be an ally, trust them.
Okay.
And you will screw up.
And I think that's the thing I'm most scared of, is screwing up.
And I bet that you will recognize it soon after it occurs, or somebody will call you out on it, or both, and lo and behold, there will be grace there.
And I think that's one of the things that scares me the most about the current situation is I know there will be grace amongst my Lutheran friends, but I'm not always sure there will be grace among my secular friends. I think we're in a moment in the larger picture where grace is in short supply.
Yeah. That I don't have an answer for that, because I'm thinking so many people in my life, whether in Germany or in the U.S., are somehow connected, particularly to my theological studies now. So that may be a problem, right? Maybe that's why I'm starting to ask how to talk to people outside the church.
Right.
I want to say one last thing, just to clarify regarding this notion of scientific theology. I do think very much that means, and really has to mean, liberation theologies.
Okay.
Queer theologies, feminist theologies, black and womanist theologies, mujerista theologies, Latinx, all of that, because theology as a science needs to take seriously all theologies coming from all locations of where science is being done.
Right.
I just wanted to make that clear, even though I'm asking these questions about method, and I'm asking how we might today, as Christians, as thinkers, borrow a bit from people like Pannenberg. I would not and utterly repudiate Pannenberg's politics in the 80s, as well as his rampant homophobia and his real incapacity to hear voices from the margins. So for me, it's a both and.
Right.
I want to borrow and use rather the insights of that rigorous understanding of what theology is. And I also want to say no one ought to get through their seminary education without reading somebody like Dolores Williams. No one. Period.
Right.
So that for me is a both and I try, I fail, obviously, but at times, but I try to hold that together somehow. Together in tension.
There you go.
So, it is a very interesting discussion.
Yeah.
We learned that Peter's all about life and Brach's off in the clouds somewhere.
I think we might have known that.
Ich hasse dich. Wirklich.
I don't know what that means, but I think I was just insulted. Or sworn at or something.
I used a very strong form of hate with you. So, until next week, I'm Brach Jennings.
And I'm Peter Clark.
And this is your friendly neighborhood Lutheran theology podcast, not taking ourselves too seriously, Stumbling Block.
Stumbling Block is a production of Silver Turkey Studios. Our Patreon producer is Ben Dittman, our executive producer is Peter Clark, and our executive director is Brach Jennings. Our theme music is by Mirrors for Windows, and we are hosted by Podbean. We can be reached by email at stumblingblockpodcast@gmail.com. Please consider supporting us at patreon.com/stumblingblock. And as always, thank you for listening.